The stark white paper of the foreclosure notice felt like ice against Ilara's trembling fingers, each typed word a small black nail hammering into the coffin of her life. 7 days, the house, once filled with the warm scent of baking bread and the sound of her husband Mark's booming laughter, was now a tomb of silence, punctuated only by the mournful creak of the floorboards as she walked. The very air seemed heavy with loss. She felt her heart tighten into a cold, hard knot as she looked at her children. Leo, her stoic 10-year-old, sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read a book, his shoulders tense. 7-year-old Mia was curled on the worn sofa, her thumb in her mouth, a habit she'd picked up again since her father's death. They were her world, and she was failing them. The debt Mark had hidden, a secret mountain of numbers revealed only after his accident, was insurmountable. The bank was a faceless monster, and its jaws were closing around them. A cold wave of nausea washed over her. She was a seamstress without a needle, a mother without a home. On the scarred wooden surface of the dining table, their entire fortune lay spread out. $300, 2 crisp $100 bills, 4 20s, a 10, a 5, and a small, pathetic pile of loose change. She counted it again, her calloused fingers fumbling with the coins. The metallic clinking was the loneliest sound in the world. Her stomach ached with a hunger that was more than just a lack of food. It was an emptiness that consumed her hope. Through the open window, the rich aroma of a neighbor grilling steaks wafted in, a cruel taunt from a universe that had forgotten her. "Mommy, I'm hungry," Mia whispered, her voice small and thin. Ilara felt a fresh wave of shame wash over her. She had nothing to offer but a few crackers from the back of the pantry. She saw Leo glance at his sister, then quickly look away, his own stomach letting out a soft, betraying rumble. The weight of their need was a physical pressure on her chest, making it hard for her to breathe. Each dollar on that table was a choice, food or gas, a night in a cheap motel, or a real meal. Her gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, to a framed photograph of Mark, his smile wide and easy, his eyes crinkling at the corners. It felt like a picture of a stranger from another lifetime. She could still feel the phantom chill of that afternoon, the crisp, impersonal tone of the police officer on her doorstep. "There's been a construction accident, ma'am. We're very sorry." The words were clinical, detached, but even then, a tiny cold worm of wrongness had squirmed in her gut. It all happened too fast. There was no investigation, just a closed casket and a mountain of debt he had never mentioned. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she thought she could still smell the faint scent of sawdust and sweat on his old work jacket hanging in the closet. A ghost of a memory that made the loneliness sharper, more acute. The grief was a physical burden. It settled in her bones, making her feel 100 years old. A constant, low-grade tremor lived in her hands now, a testament to the sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. 1 week, 168 hours. The number pulsed behind her eyes, a merciless, ticking clock counting down to destitution. The words on the eviction notice seemed to be branded onto her retinas. She had spent the last few days in a frantic haze, her voice hoarse from endless phone calls. Friends of friends, distant relatives, social services. Every conversation was a dead end, a door quietly but firmly shut in her face. The world was full of polite apologies and a distinct lack of help. At night, the true terror set in. She would lie awake, listening to the sounds of her children, Mia's soft whimpers in her sleep, her small hands clutching a worn teddy bear as if it could protect her from the encroaching darkness. And Leo. She would hear the muffled sound of his sobs from his bedroom, a quiet, desperate weeping from a boy trying so hard to be the man of the house. That sound was a blade twisting in her heart, a pain far worse than her own hunger or fear. The very air in the house had grown thick and stagnant, pressing in on her, suffocating her with the sheer weight of her powerlessness. She stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes that held the shattered remnants of their life. The cheerful sounds of the neighborhood, the distant chime of an ice cream truck, the laughter of kids playing down the street, felt like a broadcast from another planet, a world she and her children had been ejected from. Her hand tightened on the $100 bills, the paper crinkling in her sweaty palm. This wasn't just money. It was their last, fragile shield against the streets. Homelessness wasn't just a word anymore. It was a dark, looming shape at the end of a very short hallway. She looked at her children, their innocent faces etched with a worry no child should ever know, and a fierce, primal resolve hardened inside her. She didn't know how, but she would not let them be consumed. She would find a way. Her story of desperation is only just beginning, and the path forward is paved with secrets more dangerous than debt. To see if Ilara can protect her family. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what she finds in the darkness. It was in the bottom of a dusty cardboard box, tucked beneath an old, threadbare sweater that still carried the faint, ghostly scent of Mark's aftershave, that she found it. Her fingers, numb and clumsy from packing, brushed against a small, cold metal lockbox she'd never seen before. It was unlocked. A faint click echoed in the silent room as she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed newspaper clippings, was a single, folded document. It was a deed, a fragile, almost brittle piece of paper that crackled as she unfolded it. Her breath caught in her throat. A name she didn't recognize, Arthur Vance, had granted a parcel of land in a place called Blackwood Forest to Mark. A tiny, impossible flicker of hope ignited in the cold, dark cavern of her chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than the crushing weight of despair. A property, a roof. It felt like a lifeline thrown into a raging sea, and she clung to the very idea of it with all her might, her knuckles white. She spread the deed out on the floor, the paper so delicate it seemed it might turn to dust. The ink was faded, the handwriting a spidery, archaic script. Blackwood Forest. The name sounded foreign, ominous, a place from a dark fairy tale. It was an inheritance from the grandfather Mark never spoke of, the man he was estranged from long before she'd even met him. A fresh pang of confusion cut through her budding hope. Why had Mark hidden this? Why had he never mentioned a piece of land, a cabin, anything? He had let them drown in debt while this secret lay dormant in a box. The question hung in the air, another layer to the mystery of the man she thought she knew. Her stomach twisted into a tight knot of conflicting emotions, gratitude for the potential salvation, and a cold sliver of resentment for the secrecy. But right now, with eviction breathing down her neck, she couldn't afford resentment. All she could afford was this single, fragile sheet of paper and the desperate hope it represented. This was it. It wasn't a choice. It was the only path left. "We're going on a trip," she announced, forcing a brightness into her voice that felt like swallowing glass. "To a cabin in the woods. It belonged to your father's family." Mia's eyes, still red-rimmed from crying, widened with a spark of childlike adventure. A cabin, like in the storybooks. Leo, however, just looked at her, his 10-year-old gaze far too perceptive. He didn't say anything, but his silence was heavy with doubt. Ilara felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She was selling them a fantasy, a fairy tale of a woodland cottage, when she had no idea what they would find. All she had was a name on a map, but the image of her children sleeping on a sidewalk was a far more terrifying monster than any unknown forest. She had to project strength for them. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and resolve. They would go. They had to. There was no other way. The decision was made. The sound of the front door locking for the final time was a hollow, definitive click that seemed to sever her from her past. Each possession they owned was crammed into their aging station wagon, the back window obscured by a precarious mountain of bags and boxes. Ilara took one last look at the house in the rearview mirror. It wasn't just a building. It was a mausoleum of memories, of laughter, of a life that had been violently ripped away. A silent tear escaped and slid down her cheek, hot against her cold skin. She quickly wiped it away before the children could see. She turned the key, and the engine coughed to life with a reluctant groan, the sound mirroring the ache in her own soul. As she pulled away from the curb, leaving the quiet suburban street behind, she felt an overwhelming sense of vertigo, as if she were driving off the edge of the known world. She was piloting her small, broken family into the vast, terrifying unknown, with only a fading map and a desperate prayer. The first few hours of the drive were a blur of concrete and sun glare. The familiar landscape of their town receded, replaced by the monotonous drone of the highway. The air in the car was thick with unspoken anxiety. Mia had fallen into a restless sleep in the back seat, her head lolling against the window. Leo sat beside her, staring silently out at the passing world. his face a stoic, unreadable mask. Ilara's hands were clamped onto the steering wheel, her knuckles bone-white. She focused on the road, on the simple mechanics of driving, using it as an anchor against the storm of fear inside her. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was a constant, hypnotic sound, a low thrumming that vibrated through her entire body. Every mile they covered was a mile further from everything they had ever known. A profound sense of isolation began to creep in, a feeling that they were becoming untethered, drifting away from the world of normal people and stable lives. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, the character of their journey changed. The wide highways gave way to narrower country roads, and the manicured green of the suburbs was replaced by a wild, untamed landscape. Soon, they were enveloped by the trees. The sign for Blackwood Forest was old and weather-beaten, half swallowed by ivy. As they passed it, Ilara felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The temperature seemed to drop, and the sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy above. The towering pines and ancient oaks crowded the road, their branches like grasping arms, creating a tunnel of green and shadow. A strange, oppressive silence fell, the cheerful sounds of the outside world completely vanishing. All Ilara could hear was the gravelly crunch of the tires and the whisper of the wind through the leaves. A cold knot of dread began to tighten in her stomach. This place didn't feel welcoming. It felt watchful. The road deteriorated quickly. Paved asphalt became cracked tarmac, then loose gravel, and finally, a deeply rutted dirt track that seemed more like a scar on the forest floor than a road. The car bucked and groaned, its undercarriage scraping against rocks and roots with a sound that made Ilara flinch every time. Twigs and branches clawed at the windows, their scratching like desperate fingernails. In the back seat, Mia woke up and began to cry, her small whimpers cutting through the heavy silence. "Are we there yet?" she asked, her voice trembling. Leo remained quiet, but his face was pale in the growing twilight. Ilara's own hope, which had felt so vital just hours before, was now a guttering candle flame, shrinking with every jarring bump and every new shadow that flickered at the edge of her vision. The air that filtered through the vents smelled ancient and earthy, a scent of deep, damp soil and decay that clung to the back of her throat. And then, through a break in the trees, she saw it. It wasn't a cabin. It was a dark, hunched shape against the bruised purple of the evening sky, a crooked silhouette that seemed to recoil from the world. Her heart didn't just sink, it plummeted, a stone dropping into a bottomless well of despair. Every last shred of the fairy tale she had sold to her children, and to herself, evaporated in an instant. This wasn't a refuge, it was a ruin. She brought the car to a halt, the engine sputtering and dying with a final, weary sigh. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on them from all sides. It was the silence of a place long abandoned by life and hope. For a long moment, nobody moved. They just sat there, encased in their metal shell, staring at the collapsed dream before them. A feeling of being utterly, terrifyingly alone washed over Ilara, colder and more profound than any she had ever known. She forced herself to open the car door, the rusty squeal of the hinge sounding like a scream in the stillness. The air that hit her was a physical force, thick and cloying with the overpowering stench of wet, rotting timber and creeping mold. It was a smell of death and decay. She walked towards the structure, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cabin, if it could be called that, listed severely to one side, its spine broken. A huge, gaping hole in the center of the roof exposed the dark interior to the elements. The windows were not merely broken, they were jagged, empty sockets in the building's skull-like face, staring out blindly into the woods. A thick blanket of dark green ivy crawled up the walls, its tendrils probing into every crack like skeletal fingers. She felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. This wasn't a fixer-upper. This was a grave. This was worse. So much worse than being on the street. With a trembling hand, she pushed on the front door. It resisted, then gave way with a low, agonizing groan, scraping a deep gouge into the floorboards inside. A blast of cold, stagnant air rushed out to meet her, carrying an even more concentrated stench of mildew, damp earth, and the unmistakable musk of animal droppings. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the profound gloom within. The interior was a scene of utter dereliction. Leaves and filth littered the floor. Furniture was overturned and shattered, its wood swollen and black with moisture. In the corner, a cast-iron stove was rusted into a solid block of orange decay. She heard a faint, frantic skittering from within the walls, the sound of unseen things moving in the dark. A shiver, sharp and cold, traced its way down her spine. This place was not empty. It was occupied by decay, by vermin, and by a deep and unsettling wrongness that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Her gaze swept across the devastation, and the full weight of their situation crashed down upon her. The floor was a treacherous landscape of warped planks and gaping holes that revealed the dark, damp earth beneath. A disgusting, black mold spread across the walls in venomous-looking blooms, a living disease consuming the house from the inside out. The stone fireplace, which might have once been the heart of the home, was a choked ruin, filled with fallen bricks and soot from the collapsed chimney. All that remained of a bed was a rusted metal frame in the far corner, its mattress a sodden, decomposing lump that looked like a dead animal. There was no running water, no electricity, only the encroaching shadows and the suffocating silence, punctuated by the rustling of creatures she couldn't see. The hope she had harbored was a cruel joke. She had brought her children to a tomb. She turned, her movements stiff and robotic, and saw her children framed in the doorway. Their faces were stark white, their eyes wide with a horror that mirrored her own. Then Mia's composure shattered. A high, terrified wail broke from her lips, an animal sound of pure fear that echoed horribly in the dead, empty space. "I want to go home, Mommy," she sobbed, burying her face in Ilara's leg. "I want to go home." Leo didn't cry, he just stood there, his small body rigid, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked up at Ilara, and in his eyes she saw not just fear, but a flicker of betrayal. She had promised them safety. She had promised them a home, and she had led them here to this nightmare. The accusation in his gaze was a physical blow, more painful than any insult. In that moment, she knew she had failed them more completely, more catastrophically, than she had ever thought possible. The sight of her children's terror was the final crack in her own fragile armor. The strength she had manufactured, the composure she had worn like a mask for weeks, finally crumbled into dust. She sank to her knees on the filthy, damp floorboards, the cold seeping instantly through the worn fabric of her jeans. A strangled sob tore itself from her throat, raw and ragged. It wasn't just the disappointment of the cabin. It was the crushing, absolute finality of her failure. She had gambled their last $300, their last ounce of hope, on this, and she had lost. She had led her children from the danger of the city into a different, more ancient kind of peril. The profound silence of the forest pressed in, no longer just quiet, but predatory. It felt like the woods themselves were watching them, waiting for them to be swallowed by the decay. Rock bottom wasn't a place, it was a feeling, and it was consuming her whole. As if on cue, the last vestiges of daylight died, plunging the world into a blackness so complete it felt solid. The forest was no longer silent. In the utter dark, every sound was amplified, sharpened into a potential threat. The sudden snap of a twig just beyond the clearing made her heart leap into her throat. A low rustle in the undergrowth nearby sounded impossibly large. Far in the distance, the mournful hoot of an owl echoed through the trees, a lonely, chilling cry. These were not the gentle sounds of nature. They were the noises of a world that was indifferent to her suffering, a world full of teeth and claws. They were miles from the nearest town, miles from any light or any help. Their phone had lost its signal hours ago. Their car, which had barely survived the journey, was their only shelter. A cold, primal fear, slick and oily, churned in her stomach. They were utterly and completely trapped. With a surge of adrenaline, Ilara scrambled to her feet, grabbing her children's hands. "Back in the car, now," she commanded, her voice a harsh whisper. She bundled them into the back seat of the old station wagon, the only defensible space in this hostile world, and slammed the locks down. The clicks echoed like gunshots in the night, huddled together under a single thin blanket that smelled of their old life. They listened. The forest was alive with noises now, a symphony of unseen movements that surrounded them on all sides. The cold of the night began to seep through the car's glass, a chilling premonition of the long, dark hours ahead. Mia's terrified wails had subsided into quiet, hiccuping sobs against her mother's side. Leo was unnervingly still, a small, silent statue of fear. Ilara stared out into the impenetrable blackness, her own reflection a pale, ghostly mask in the window. She had come seeking a roof over their heads and had found only a deeper, darker, more terrifying despair. The morning light that filtered through the car's grimy windows was a thin, grey gruel, offering no warmth, only illumination for their misery. Ilara's neck was a column of stiff, aching pain from sleeping slumped against the door. Mia was still asleep, her small face smudged with dirt and tear tracks, her breath fogging the cold glass. Leo was awake, staring out at the ruined cabin with an expression of quiet, grim acceptance that broke his mother's heart. The cold had seeped deep into her bones overnight, a damp, persistent chill that no blanket could fend off. Her stomach was a hollow, aching void. She could hear the faint, desperate rumbling of Leo's hunger, a sound he tried to stifle by pressing a hand to his stomach. The initial terror of the night had subsided, replaced by a cold, hard despair that felt even heavier. This was it. This was their new reality. The forest was silent again, but its quiet felt less predatory in the light and more profoundly, crushingly indifferent. There was no going back. The gas tank was nearly empty, and their $300 wouldn't get them far. They were marooned. A bitter resolve began to curdle in the pit of her stomach. She would not let her children waste away in the back seat of a car. She would not let this place, this monument to decay, defeat them. If this was all they had, then she would fight it. She would carve out a space for them, even if it was just for a few days, a week, until she could think of something, anything else. She felt a surge of adrenaline, born not of hope, but of pure, stubborn anger. Anger at Mark for his secrets, anger at the world for its cruelty, and anger at this cabin for being a broken promise. Her hands, which had trembled with fear all night, were now steady. "Okay," she whispered to herself, the sound a dry rasp in the enclosed space. "Okay." She took a deep, shaky breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. The image of Mia's terrified face and Leo's betrayed eyes from the night before flashed in her mind, acting as a painful, necessary fuel. She had to do something. Anything was better than just sitting here, waiting for the despair to swallow them whole. It was a fight for simple dignity. Getting out of the car felt like stepping into an entirely different world from the one they had left behind. The air was crisp and carried the rich, loamy scent of the forest floor, a mix of pine needles, damp earth, and something wild and clean. It was a stark contrast to the stagnant, musty air inside the cabin. "Leo, come on," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "We need to get to work." Mia looked at her, her eyes wide and still full of yesterday's fear. "Work on what, Mommy?" she asked, her voice a tiny thread of sound. "We're going to clean," Ilara announced, forcing a confidence she did not possess. "We are going to make a space for us to sleep that isn't the car. We just need to clear one corner. We'll make a camp inside." She felt a pang of guilt at the lie, the pretense that this was a manageable task, an adventure. But the fear in her children's eyes was a fire she had to put out, even if it meant using the thinnest of blankets. For now, purpose was the only medicine she could offer them against the poison of hopelessness. Leo, surprisingly, was the first to move. He climbed out of the car without a word, his small face set in a determined frown. He walked over to the cabin's gaping doorway and peered inside, his shoulders squared as if preparing for battle. Ilara's heart swelled with a painful mix of pride and sorrow. He was too young to be this serious, too young to carry the weight of their world on his narrow shoulders. She followed him, Mia clinging tightly to her hand, her small body trembling. Stepping back inside the ruin in the daylight was somehow worse. The light revealed the true extent of the filth and decay, the thick, greasy cobwebs, the layers of animal droppings, the sinister spread of black mold that seemed to pulse in the gloom. The smell was overpowering, a physical presence that made her gag. She felt a wave of dizziness, the sheer impossibility of the task crashing down on her again. For a moment, she faltered, her resolve wavering, but then she felt Leo's small hand find hers, his grip surprisingly strong. It was all the encouragement she needed. Their first task was simply to clear a space. Ilara found a splintered piece of a door that she could use as a makeshift broom. and she began the back-breaking work of sweeping years of leaves, dirt, and unidentifiable filth out of the front door. The dust billowed up in thick, choking clouds that caught in her throat and made her eyes water. Each scrape of the wood against the floor was a loud, grating noise in the oppressive silence. Mia, too scared to venture far into the gloom, was tasked with collecting dry sticks and leaves from just outside the clearing. A small, busy task to keep her mind occupied. Ilara focused on the physical labor, on the rhythmic motion of sweeping, pouring all her fear and frustration into the work. Her muscles, soft from years at a sewing machine, quickly began to protest, burning with an unfamiliar fire. But the pain was a welcome distraction. It was real, tangible, something she could fight against. Sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled down her temples, carving clean paths through the grime on her skin. Leo, with his quiet and methodical nature, had taken on a different job. "Mom, there are holes in the floor," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large, empty room. "Animals can get in." He pointed to several places where the floorboards had rotted through or warped, leaving dark, ominous gaps that led to the damp earth beneath. Ilara felt a fresh shiver of fear. He was right. The skittering sounds from the night before were not just in the walls. "Can you find some rocks, some pieces of wood, and block them?" she asked, grateful for his practical mind. "Block all the ones you can find." He nodded seriously and set to work, his small frame moving with a purpose that belied his age. He became a small boy at war with a derelict house. Ilara watched him for a moment, her heart aching. He was methodically testing boards, finding stones that fit snugly into the gaps, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not just blocking holes, he was building a fortress, trying to make them safe in his own small way. The sound of his work, the clink of stone and the thud of wood, became a new rhythm in the cabin. An hour passed in a blur of strenuous, grimy labor. Ilara had managed to clear a 10 by 10-foot square in the corner of the main room, sweeping the worst of the debris out into the open. The floor beneath was still filthy, but it was solid. She had dragged their blankets from the car, shaking them out vigorously in the open air, and laid them down to create a makeshift pallet. It was a pathetic imitation of a home, but it was theirs. The air was still thick with the smell of mold, but the vigorous sweeping had stirred up the dust, momentarily overpowering the stench with the scent of dry, ancient wood. She stood back, her hands on her aching hips, breathing heavily. Her whole body screamed in protest. Her hands were already red and raw, and she knew she would have blisters by nightfall. But looking at that small, cleanish patch of floor, she felt the first, tiny, fragile spark of accomplishment she had felt in weeks. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was a foothold. It was a start. "Mom, Mom, come look!" Leo's voice, sharp with excitement, cut through the air. It was the most emotion she'd heard from him in days. She rushed over to the smaller back room, what might have once been a bedroom. He was kneeling beside a floorboard near the wall, his face flushed with discovery. "This one," he said, pointing. "It's loose, but it's not rotten. It feels different." Ilara knelt beside him, the cold of the floor seeping into her knees. She pressed on the board he indicated. He was right. While the boards around it were soft and spongy with rot, this one was solid oak, and it moved under her hand, rocking back and forth with a clean seesaw motion. It wasn't warped by water. It had been intentionally cut. A thrill, sharp and unexpected, shot through her. It was the feeling of a loose thread on a garment, a hint of something hidden. "Help me pry it up," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The grim reality of their survival was momentarily forgotten, replaced by the electric hum of a genuine mystery. Together, they worked their fingers into the crack at the edge of the board. The wood was smooth, not splintered. It took their combined strength, their hands grimy, their muscles straining, but finally the board lifted up with a soft, sucking sound. It wasn't nailed down. It had been designed to be removed. Beneath it was not the damp, dark earth she expected, but a small, perfectly square, wood-lined cavity about a foot deep. It was a secret compartment, a tiny hiding place deliberately built into the floor of the cabin. A wave of goosebumps broke out across Ilara's arms, a primal reaction to the unexpected, to the sudden intrusion of a long-dead secret into their desperate present. The air that rose from the hole was cool and dry, carrying a faint, pleasant scent of cedar, a stark contrast to the surrounding decay. It was like opening a time capsule. For a long moment, they both just stared into the small dark void, their breath held in a silent, shared anticipation. What had someone so long ago felt was important enough to hide so carefully. "There's something in there," Leo whispered, his voice filled with awe. He pointed a trembling finger into the darkness. Ilara leaned closer, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. At the bottom of the cavity, glinting faintly in the sliver of light that reached it, was a small object. It was metallic, but it was impossible to make out what it was in the deep shadow. A cold knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. What if it was something dangerous? What if this was a part of the house's decay they shouldn't disturb? But the curiosity was a powerful, undeniable force, pulling her forward. It was the first interesting, non-threatening thing that had happened since they arrived. "Stay here," she told Leo, her voice soft but firm. She reached her hand slowly, cautiously, into the cool, dark space. Her fingers brushed against something smooth, cold and metallic, and then against the soft, brittle texture of old fabric. It felt ancient, sacred, like a relic in a tomb. With a feeling of profound reverence, she closed her fingers around the object and lifted it into the light. It lay in her palm, surprisingly heavy. It was a single, old-fashioned brass key, its head ornate with a simple scrollwork design. The brass was tarnished with age, a deep, greenish-brown patina covering most of its surface, but the edges still shone with a dull, golden light. Tied to its head with a simple knot was a loop of what had once been a bright red ribbon, now faded by time to a pale, dusky pink. It was beautiful, an object from another time, imbued with a sense of history and purpose. It was not a key for a door. It was too small, too ornate. It was a key for a box, a treasure chest, a diary. Ilara felt a dizzying rush of sensation. The cold, solid weight of the key in her hand was a stark, tangible piece of a puzzle she didn't even know existed. A loop had been opened. The question hung in the air between her and her son, silent and electrifying. What did this key unlock? The discovery of the key changed the very atmosphere in the cabin. The oppressive weight of despair lifted, momentarily replaced by the lighter, more energized feeling of a hunt. Even Mia, drawn by her brother's excited shouts, seemed to forget her fear. Her eyes wide with the promise of a storybook adventure. A key, a secret key. For the first time, the cabin was not just a ruin, it was a place with a secret. "We have to find the lock," Leo declared, his voice full of a child's unwavering conviction. Ilara felt a smile touch her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. It was a weak, fragile thing, but it was there. The search gave them a shared purpose, a mission that united them against the bleakness of their circumstances. They were no longer just victims of fate. They were explorers, detectives on the trail of a long-forgotten mystery. The key felt warm in her pocket now, a small, hard promise of something more than just survival. It was a whisper from the past, and she felt compelled to find out what it was saying. Their search began inside the cabin itself. They moved with a newfound energy, their eyes scanning every surface, every piece of broken furniture, for a keyhole. Ilara ran her hands over the rusted face of the cast-iron stove, her fingers probing for any hidden latch or compartment. Nothing. Leo meticulously examined the few remaining drawers in a rotted dresser, pulling them out completely to look for false bottoms. They found only more dust and the desiccated husks of dead insects. Mia, in her own way, contributed by peering into every dark corner and under every piece of debris, calling out "not here," with cheerful finality. The process was slow and frustrating. The cabin, which had seemed so empty, was now a labyrinth of possibilities. Every shadow, every crack, every piece of rusted metal seemed like it could be a clue. The initial excitement began to wane, replaced by a familiar sense of futility. Her heart began to sink. What if the thing the key belonged to was long gone, destroyed by time or taken by someone else? Ilara's hand instinctively went to the key in her pocket, its sharp edges a small, grounding comfort. She refused to let the hope die. It was the only thing they had. "Think," she muttered to herself, her voice a low hum. "If you wanted to hide something, and you had the key in a secret spot in the bedroom, where would you hide the box?" not in the main house. It was too exposed, too vulnerable to the elements, even back then. The roof had likely always been a problem. It had to be somewhere more protected, somewhere separate. Her gaze drifted towards the open doorway, out into the clearing. Her eyes landed on the other structure, the one she had barely registered in her initial wave of despair. The woodshed. It was set back from the cabin, partially shielded by a thick stand of pine trees. It was dilapidated, certainly, but its roof seemed more intact than the cabin's. A jolt of certainty went through her. Of course, it wouldn't be in the house. It would be in the woodshed. Her heart began to pound again, a steady, hopeful rhythm. "Come on," she said to the children, her voice ringing with renewed purpose. "I think I know where to look." She strode out of the cabin, the children trailing eagerly behind her, their earlier exhaustion forgotten. As they approached the woodshed, the smell of damp earth and mold was replaced by a different, sharper scent. It was the smell of oldest cut wood, of pine resin, and the faint metallic tang of oil and rust. It was a workman's smell, a scent of purpose and labor that felt jarringly different from the cabin's scent of pure decay. The woodshed's door hung crookedly on a single, rusted hinge, and she had to put her shoulder into it to force it open. It swung inward with a prolonged, agonizing squeal of metal on metal, a sound that seemed to protest their intrusion. The air inside was thick and still, and shafts of dusty light pierced the gloom through cracks in the walls, illuminating a chaotic jumble of forgotten tools and rotting supplies. The mystery deepened. The inside of the woodshed was a time capsule of a different sort. Rusted saws and axes hung on the walls like ancient, forgotten weapons. A workbench along one wall was littered with decaying leather harnesses, cracked and stiff with age, and glass jars filled with murky, unidentifiable liquids. In one corner stood a stack of firewood, now covered in a pale, fuzzy layer of white fungus. The place felt deeply personal, a testament to the life of the man who had worked here, Mark's grandfather. Ilara felt a pang of sadness for this unknown ancestor, a man whose life had ended here, whose secrets were slowly being consumed by the forest. She felt like an intruder, a grave robber disturbing a sacred space. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crept over her skin. This place felt different from the cabin. The cabin felt empty, abandoned. This place felt like it was waiting. It felt like it had been keeping its secrets safe for a very long time. Leo and Mia, sensing the shift in atmosphere, stayed close to her, their adventurous spirit tempered by a sense of awe and a little bit of fear. Ilara's eyes scanned the cluttered space, looking for anything that seemed out of place. A chest would be too obvious, too easy to find. It would be hidden, concealed. Her gaze fell upon a large, dark pile in the back corner of the shed. At first, she thought it was just a heap of old rags or sacks, but as she drew closer, she saw it was a single, massive sheet of canvas, the kind used for old military tents or boat sails. It was stiff with age and damp, and covered in a thick layer of dust and spider webs. It was deliberately placed, not just tossed aside. It was covering something. A lump formed in her throat. She knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her bones, that she had found it. She could almost feel the presence of the object beneath the canvas, a silent, pulsing weight in the dusty air. "Help me move this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She and Leo each took a corner of the heavy canvas. The fabric was rough and cold, and it resisted their pull, stiff as a board. With a great, coordinated heave, they dragged it aside. The sound it made scraping across the dirt floor was loud and jarring, and there it was. Revealed in the dusty light was a large, heavy-looking wooden chest. It was made of dark, almost black wood, bound with thick straps of rusted iron. It wasn't ornate or fancy. It was functional, solid, and clearly built to last. It was sealed with a single, heavy iron lock on the front, its surface pitted with corrosion. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. It was a perfect match. The simple, utilitarian design of the chest, the heavy-duty lock. It was exactly the kind of thing that would be opened by the simple, sturdy brass key she held in her pocket. The final piece of the physical puzzle was right in front of her. With trembling fingers, she retrieved the key. The metal felt ice-cold against her clammy palm. She knelt before the chest, the damp earth of the woodshed floor soaking into the knees of her jeans. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. This was it. the culmination of the day's strange, unexpected turn. She could feel Leo and Mia pressing in close behind her, their small, warm bodies a comfort against her back. She inserted the key into the lock. For a horrifying second it resisted, and a wave of crushing disappointment washed over her. But then, with a little more pressure, it slid home with a satisfying, solid click. It was a perfect fit. She took a deep breath, held it, and turned the key. There was a loud, grating metallic crunch as the old, rusted tumblers inside the lock finally shifted for the first time in decades. The sound was deafening in the silence of the shed. The lock was open. A wave of dizziness swept over her as she lifted the heavy iron hasp. For a moment, she hesitated. Opening this chest felt like crossing a threshold. It was an irrevocable act. Whatever was inside would change things. She knew it. The life of quiet desperation, the simple, brutal struggle for survival, that was a story she understood. This felt like stepping into a different story entirely, one whose rules she did not know. A story that had started long before she was born, with a man she had never met. With a final, deep breath to steady her nerves, she placed her hands on the lid of the chest. It was heavy. Taking a firm grip, she pulled it upwards. The hinges, long fused with rust, screamed in protest, a high, mournful shriek that echoed through the shed and seemed to die in the trees outside. The lid creaked open, revealing the darkness within. The first thing that hit her was the smell. It wasn't the smell of rot or decay. It was a clean, dry, and surprisingly pleasant scent. It was the rich, aromatic perfume of old paper, the faint, spicy fragrance of cedar wood, and something else, the ghost of a floral perfume, faint and impossibly familiar. It was a scent from her own past, a scent she hadn't smelled in 20 years. Her eyes adjusted to the dim interior of the chest, and she saw what was inside. It wasn't gold, it wasn't jewels. It was letters, 2 stacks of them neatly bundled and tied. The top bundle was wrapped in a protective sheath of oilcloth. The paper was thick, creamy, and familiar. The handwriting was a looping, youthful cursive that made her stomach clench with a sudden, violent shock of recognition. She didn't need to read a single word. She knew that handwriting as well as she knew her own face in the mirror, because it was hers. Her mind reeled, struggling to process the impossible truth before her. These were the letters she had written to Mark 2 decades ago, back when they were young, and their love was a fierce, all-consuming fire. She had poured her entire soul onto those pages, but she had never sent them. They had a terrible, vicious argument just before he left for what he had told her was a special military training program. In a fit of hurt and anger, she had taken the entire stack of letters, her heart breaking with every motion, and had thrown them into the fireplace. She remembered the sight of them curling into black ash, the words of love turning to smoke. She remembered the acrid smell, the feeling of finality, of something beautiful being irrevocably destroyed. She had watched them burn. She had cried for hours after they were gone. A cold, terrifying chill washed over her. How could they be here? How could they be perfectly preserved in this chest, in this forgotten cabin, hundreds of miles away? Her hands shook so violently she could barely function. She carefully lifted the bundle of her own letters out of the chest, her fingers tracing the familiar loops of her own name on the top envelope. It felt like holding a ghost. The oilcloth was cool and smooth. It made no sense. It was a physical impossibility, a paradox sitting in her lap. Had Mark somehow saved them from the fire? But how? He had left before she burned them. It was a logical impossibility that sent her mind spinning into a vortex of confusion. The very foundations of her memory, of her own past, seemed to be cracking. She felt a wave of vertigo, as if the ground beneath her had suddenly become unstable. The cabin, the woods, her own desperate situation, it all faded into the background, eclipsed by this single, shrieking question. How? How were these letters here? The mystery of the key and the chest was nothing compared to the mystery of these impossible artifacts from her own youth. As she stared, mesmerized, at the letters in her hands, her gaze drifted back to the now half-empty chest. There was something else. Beneath where her letters had been resting was a second bundle. This one was smaller, the papers more worn and fragile-looking. It was tied not with oilcloth, but with a simple piece of rough twine. The handwriting on the top letter of this second stack was different. It was a cramped, angular script, written with a heavy hand. but it was just as familiar as her own. It was Mark's. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her heart, which had been pounding with confusion, now seemed to stop altogether. She gently placed her own letters on the ground beside her and reached into the chest for the second bundle. The paper felt brittle and delicate, as if it might crumble to dust in her fingers. They were letters from him, letters he had written but had never sent. Her stomach twisted into a painful knot of anticipation and dread. She untied the twine with trembling fingers, the rough fibers scraping against her skin. The knot came loose, and the small stack of letters fell open in her lap. The top page was dated just a week after he had supposedly left for his training. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and the world tilted on its axis. The words leaped off the page, searing themselves into her brain. "My dearest Ilara," it began, "I have to tell you the truth. There is no military program. I'm not a soldier. I lied. I lied about everything." A strangled gasp escaped her lips. The air was suddenly thin, impossible to breathe. The woodshed, the children, the cold, it all vanished. There was only the rustle of this fragile paper and the silent scream of her husband's 20-year-old confession. She was holding the real key, not the brass key to the chest, but the key to Mark's secret life, to his guilt, and, she suspected with a sudden dawning horror, to his death. The mystery of the cabin had just become the mystery of her entire life, and she was standing on the precipice of a truth more terrifying than any ruin. The brittle pages felt like sheets of ice in Ilara's hands, each of Mark's desperately scrawled words, a shard of glass piercing the fragile fantasy of their shared past. There was no military, no training program. The man she had loved, the father of her children, had been a stranger living a double life built on a foundation of terrifying lies. A cold sweat broke out across her skin, chilling her to the bone despite the shed's stuffy air. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The scent of the old paper, a mixture of dry dust and faded ink, filled her nostrils, a smell that would forever be linked to this moment of absolute betrayal. She read on, her eyes flying across the cramped script, the confession of a man she thought she knew. He hadn't been a soldier. He had been a pawn. He had been a ghost, haunting the lives of innocent people, and the guilt had been consuming him from the inside out, a cancer on his soul for 2 decades. The entire story of their life together was a carefully constructed fiction, and the truth was a horror story. His words painted a grim, grey picture of coercion and fear. Straight out of high school, desperate for money and direction, he had fallen in with a crew, a group of men who worked for a powerful, unseen figure. Their job was simple and brutal. They were professional intimidators. They targeted poor, rural families, people with land but no power, and used threats, sabotage, and relentless pressure to force them to sell their ancestral homes for pennies on the dollar. Mark wrote of his shame, a palpable self-loathing that bled through the ink. He described the faces of the people he had terrorized, the old men with calloused hands and the young mothers with fear in their eyes. He was trapped, blackmailed with some youthful indiscretion that had escalated into a lifetime of servitude. A wave of nausea churned in Ilara's stomach. The Mark she knew, the man who would gently bandage Mia's scraped knees and patiently teach Leo to fish, was also this man, a reluctant monster haunted by his own actions. Then came the sentence that made her blood run cold, a sentence about this very cabin, this very land. Her eyes locked onto the name of the previous owner, the grandfather Mark was supposedly estranged from, Arthur Vance, the same name on the original deed. Mark confessed that his grandfather hadn't died in an accident. He had been the one landowner who refused to break, who had fought back with a stubborn, righteous fury. The crew had been sent to handle him. Mark had been forced to watch as they took his own grandfather into the deep woods. He wrote that he could still hear the old man's defiant shouts echoing through the trees before they were abruptly silenced. It was murder. This land, their only refuge, was soaked in the blood of their own family. The cabin wasn't an inheritance, it was blood money, a prize awarded to Mark for his silence and complicity in the death of his own grandfather. A single, hot tear fell from her eye and splattered onto the page, smearing the ink of a dead man's confession. The horror deepened, spiraling into the present. The letters grew more frantic, the handwriting more jagged. As they neared the date of Mark's own death, he had finally decided to break away. The guilt had become an unbearable weight, and the thought of his own children growing up on the profits of such profound evil had shattered his resolve to stay silent. He was gathering evidence. He was planning to go to the authorities, to expose the entire operation, to burn down the whole rotten structure from the inside. He knew the risks. He knew they would not let him walk away. The final letter, written just 2 days before his death, was a goodbye. "If you are reading this, Ilara," he wrote, "it means they found out. It means they silenced me. My accident was no accident, but the proof is with you. It's all here. Don't let them get away with it. For me, for my grandfather." The clinical words of the police officer echoed in her mind. A construction accident. It was a lie. Her gut feeling had been right all along. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution. She finally understood. The impossible mystery of her own letters, the ones she had burned, was solved in a heartbreaking footnote. Mark explained that on the night of their terrible argument, after she had gone to bed, he had crept downstairs. He couldn't bear the thought of her words of love being destroyed. He had retrieved the letters from the cold fireplace, brushing the soot from them, and had kept them with him ever since. They were his penance and his only solace, his one tangible proof that he had once been a good man, worthy of her love. He hid his confession, the evidence of his dark life, inside the one pure thing he felt he had left, the love she had once had for him. He had nestled the proof of his crimes within the proof of his redemption. The poetic tragedy of the gesture was a dagger in her heart. He had built a tomb for his secrets out of their love letters. She hugged the brittle papers to her chest, the ghost of her husband feeling closer and more agonizingly distant than ever before. The rustle of the letters was the only sound in the universe. The woodshed, the forest, the entire world had faded into a silent, grey void. Ilara knelt on the damp earth, reality reassembling itself around her, sharp and terrifyingly new. The silence of the forest was no longer indifferent. It was menacing. Every creak of the old wood, every distant rustle of leaves, sounded like a footstep. She was sitting on a powder keg, and she had just lit the fuse. The letters in her hands weren't a story, they were a weapon that had gotten her husband killed. She looked out through the woodshed's grimy doorway and saw Leo and Mia playing near the car, their small forms silhouetted against the trees. A tidal wave of terror, cold and absolute, washed over her. They were not safe. This wasn't a refuge. It was the epicenter of the danger. They were sleeping in a murderer's trophy room, on land stolen through violence, and the man responsible was still out there. Suddenly, a sound cut through the stillness, alien and invasive. It was the low, gravelly crunch of tires on the dirt track leading to the cabin. It wasn't the sound of their old station wagon. This was a deeper, heavier sound, the confident purr of a powerful engine. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. She scrambled to her feet, stuffing the precious, damning letters deep into the waistband of her jeans, the rough paper scratching against her skin. She peered cautiously around the edge of the woodshed door. Her blood turned to ice. A vehicle was slowly, deliberately pulling into the clearing. It was a massive, gleaming black luxury sedan, its paint so polished it reflected the dark trees like a distorted mirror. It was utterly, obscenely out of place in this world of rot and rust, a predator invading a fragile ecosystem. The engine cut off, and a silence even heavier than before descended upon the clearing. The car just sat there for a long moment, its tinted windows like the blank eyes of a shark. The driver's side door opened with a soft, expensive-sounding click. A man emerged. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that seemed immune to the forest's grime. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and they crunched on the gravel with an assertive, proprietary sound. He looked to be in his late 60s, with a full head of silver hair and a handsome, tanned face. He moved with the easy, confident grace of a man accustomed to being in charge, a man for whom the world bent to his will. He surveyed the ruined cabin, his lips pursed in a look of mild distaste, before his gaze swept the clearing and landed directly on Ilara. Half hidden by the woodshed, he smiled, a bright, practiced, welcoming smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. It was the smile of a politician, a benefactor, a predator. He knew she was here. He had come for her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. "Ilara! Ilara Vance!" he called out, his voice a smooth, rich baritone that carried easily across the clearing. It was cultured and friendly, but it sent a fresh wave of terror through her. He knew her name, he knew Mark's last name, which she had taken. "My name is Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell. I was so terribly sorry to hear about your husband's unfortunate accident." The words dripped with a synthetic sympathy that made her skin crawl. He walked slowly towards her, his smile never faltering. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze flicking between her and the children, who had stopped their play and were now staring at the stranger with wide-open, uncertain eyes. "I own most of the land surrounding this little patch," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the forest. "I was a business associate of Mark's, you could say. He spoke of you often." The lie was so bald, so effortless, it was breathtaking. He was sizing her up, his eyes missing nothing, from her worn-out jeans to the fear she was desperately trying to hide. He let his gaze drift back to the dilapidated cabin, a look of faux pity on his face. "This is no place for a woman and her children," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of fatherly concern. "It's a ruin. Frankly, it's a danger. I was shocked to learn you were staying out here." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. "Look, I know things must be difficult for you right now. I'd like to help. I'll take this land off your hands. It's not worth much, but I can offer you, say, $5,000, cash, enough to get you and your lovely children a fresh start, somewhere safe. $5,000 for land that was the key to a multi-million-dollar development, for land that her husband and his grandfather had been murdered for." The insult was so profound, so dismissive, it momentarily eclipsed her fear with a surge of white-hot rage. She could feel the sharp corners of Mark's letters digging into her skin, a physical reminder of the truth he was trying to bury with a pittance. She must have hesitated a fraction too long, her expression giving something away. Caldwell's smile tightened, the warmth vanishing completely, leaving only a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. He took a small step closer, his voice dropping to a low, confidential murmur that was far more menacing than a shout. "Your husband was a good man, but he was in over his head," he said softly. "He didn't appreciate how complicated business can get out here, how things can go wrong." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Accidents happen all the time. This is a big, dark forest, Ilara. It's a very easy place to get lost, a very dangerous place for a widow who doesn't know the lay of the land." The threat was no longer veiled. It was as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. He was telling her that what happened to Mark could happen to her. He was telling her that he held the power of life and death in this forest. Her entire body went rigid. The air thickened, making it hard to breathe. She could feel her children's frightened eyes on her. She was a mouse, and the hawk was circling overhead, its shadow falling over her and her young. Caldwell's smile returned, once again a mask of pleasantry. "Just something to think about," he said cheerfully, as if he had just been discussing the weather. He pulled a crisp white business card from his pocket and held it out to her. "You have my number. Call me when you've made the sensible decision." She didn't move. She couldn't. Her limbs were locked in place by a paralyzing fear. After a moment, he simply placed the card on a nearby tree stump and turned his back on her, walking calmly and confidently back to his gleaming black car. The click of his car door shutting was like a cell door slamming shut. The powerful engine roared to life, and he drove away without a backward glance, leaving a cloud of dust and a profound, suffocating silence in his wake. Ilara stood frozen for a full minute after the sound of his engine had faded, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. The business card on the stump seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Caldwell, the man from Mark's letters, the architect of her family's destruction, he wasn't just a name on a page anymore. He was real. He had a face, a voice, and he knew exactly who she was and where to find her. The letters she had clutched as a tool for justice now felt like her own death warrant. The weight of them against her skin was immense, a burning brand of truth that could get her and her children killed. The woods were no longer a neutral space. They were his territory. The shadows between the trees were no longer empty. They were filled with his men, with the ghosts of his victims, with the promise of his threat. She was trapped, utterly and completely. She sank to the ground, her legs giving out from under her. The rage she had felt was gone, washed away by a tsunami of pure, undiluted terror. She pulled the letters from her waistband, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold them. This small, fragile stack of paper was the only thing standing between Caldwell and his ultimate prize, and she and her children were standing directly in his path. She looked over at Leo and Mia, who were now huddled together by the car, their small faces pale with fear. They had heard the menace in his voice, had felt the predatory chill in the air. Her decision to come here, born of desperation, had led them into the jaws of the monster himself. She had thought homelessness was the worst thing that could happen to them. She had been so naive. There were things so much worse than poverty, so much darker than despair, and they were surrounded by them. She held the truth in one hand and the lives of her children in the other. Caldwell's offer echoed in her mind. $5,000, a pittance, an insult, but it was also an escape. She could take the money, disappear and try to forget this cabin, this forest, this whole nightmare. She could burn the letters, just as she had tried to do once before, and let the secrets turn to ash, ensuring her children's safety. Or she could honor her dead husband's last wish. She could fight, but fighting meant staying. It meant facing a man who had murdered at least 2 people to protect his empire and had just implicitly threatened to make her the third. He thought she was a scared, helpless widow. Maybe the safest thing to do was to let him keep thinking that, what would you do in her place? Would you take the deal, burn the evidence, and run to protect your children? Or would you risk everything for a justice that could cost you your life? The silence Caldwell left behind was a living thing, a suffocating presence that pressed in on Ilara from all sides. Her gaze was fixed on the white business card sitting on the stump, a stark and mocking testament to the man's obscene power. It was a poisoned dart left in the heart of her sanctuary. The forest, which had felt indifferent before, now felt actively malevolent. She imagined eyes watching her from behind every ancient trunk. The rustle of leaves was no longer nature, but the sound of his men closing in. The weight of the letters against her skin was a burning, physical burden. They were both a shield and a target, the proof of her husband's late-blooming courage, and the reason she and her children were now in the crosshairs of a killer. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, but underneath it all, she could almost smell the cloying fragrance of Caldwell's expensive cologne, a lingering trace of the predator, who had just marked his territory and everything in it, including her. Her terror was a physical entity, a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. It was a paralysis that started in her limbs and spread inward, freezing her very thoughts. But then she saw them, Leo and Mia, huddled together near the rusted station wagon, their faces pale masks of fear. Mia's thumb was jammed in her mouth, her eyes wide and glassy. Leo stood rigidly, his small hands clenched into fists, a tiny, defiant statue trying to ward off the vastness of the threat. The sight of them shattered her paralysis. A different feeling surged through her, a ferocious, primal wave of maternal fury that was hotter than any fear. This wasn't just about justice for Mark anymore. It wasn't about land or money. It was about the 2 small, breathing, terrified lives that depended on her. Caldwell had made a fatal error. He hadn't just threatened a widow, he had threatened a mother. A cold, hard resolve began to form in the pit of her stomach, solidifying the swirling chaos of her emotions into a single, sharp point of purpose. She strode over to the stump, her movements stiff and robotic. She snatched the business card, the crisp paper cool against her sweaty palm. For a moment, she stared at the elegant, embossed letters of his name, the name of the man who had destroyed her family. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, she crumpled it into a tight, hard ball. It was a small, pathetic act of defiance, but it felt monumental. It was a refusal, a declaration of war. She tossed the mangled card into the dirt and turned to her children, forcing a mask of calm onto her face. Her heart was a wild drum, but her voice was steady. "Come on," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We're going inside. We stick together." She gathered them close, her arms a protective wall around their small bodies, and led them away from the open clearing, back towards the dark. Gaping more of the ruined cabin, it wasn't a sanctuary, but it was defensible. It was the only ground she had to hold. Just as they reached the rotting porch, another sound made her freeze. It was not the confident crunch of an engine, but a soft, shuffling noise coming from the dense tree line to the west. It was the sound of slow, hesitant footsteps dragging through the thick layer of fallen leaves and twigs. Ilara's body went rigid, every muscle tensing for a fight. She instinctively shoved the children behind her, shielding them with her body, her eyes straining to pierce the deep shadows between the trees. Her mind screamed. Had Caldwell left someone behind to watch them? Was this the beginning of the end? A quietly methodical approach before the final attack. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. A dry branch snapped with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she braced herself, her hands curling into useless fists. The forest seemed to be holding its breath with her, waiting for the threat to emerge from the gloom. From the shadows, a figure slowly materialized. It was not one of Caldwell's suited thugs. It was an old man, thin and stooped, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick that looked like it had been torn from a root system. His face was a road map of wrinkles, weathered and tanned like old leather, and a messy thatch of white hair stuck out from under a worn wool cap. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of age, his pale blue eyes blinking in the sudden brightness of the clearing. He looked less like a threat and more like a part of the forest itself, as ancient and weary as the trees he had just stepped out from between. He stopped and looked not at Ilara, but at the tracks in the dirt where the black sedan had been parked. A look of profound, ancient hatred tightened his wrinkled face, a grimace that pulled his thin lips back from his teeth. The sight of this raw emotion, directed at her enemy, was the first thing that chipped away at Ilara's immediate fear. His gaze finally lifted and met hers. There was no menace in his eyes, only a deep, sorrowful weariness. "Saw that black devil's car," he said, his voice a dry, raspy whisper like the sound of dead leaves skittering across pavement. Figured he'd come sniffing around soon enough, once he heard someone was occupying the old Vance place. He spat on the ground, a gesture of pure contempt. "That man's a poison in these woods. Has been for decades." He took another slow step forward, his eyes assessing Ilara, then her children hiding behind her. He seemed to see everything in a single glance, their fear, their poverty, their desperation. "You must be Mark's wife," he stated. It wasn't a question. "You have his eyes, that same haunted look." The personal observation, the mention of Mark, sent a jolt through Ilara. This man was not a stranger. He was connected to this place, to her past, in a way she couldn't yet understand. Ilara's suspicion warred with a desperate, burgeoning hope. She remained silent, clutching her children, her body still a tense shield. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice tight. The old man's gaze softened slightly. He pointed a trembling, arthritic finger towards the cabin. This place was his life, his heart. I was his friend, the best he had. A lump formed in Ilara's throat. "Whose friend?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. The old man looked at her, his pale eyes shining with unshed tears. "Arthur Vance. You're Mark's grandfather. My name's Arthur, too. We were both Arthurs, him and me. He built this cabin with his own 2 hands, and I watched him die for it. The name. The same name from the faded deed, the same name from Mark's terrible secret confession. This wasn't just a neighbor. This was the guardian of the story, the witness. The man Mark's letter had unknowingly pointed her towards. He was the last living piece of the puzzle. That was it. The dam of her composure, so carefully constructed, finally shattered. The loneliness of her fight, the crushing weight of the secret, became too much to bear. With a choked sob, she let go of her children and stumbled forward. Her hands, shaking uncontrollably, pulled the bundle of Mark's letters from her shirt. She held them out to him, an offering, a plea. "He knew," she gasped, tears streaming down her face, carving paths through the grime. Mark knew. He wrote it all down, about his grandfather, about Caldwell. Arthur's eyes widened as he saw the brittle, yellowed pages. He reached out a trembling hand and gently touched the top letter, his fingers tracing the familiar, angry script of a man he once knew. He nodded slowly, a profound sadness settling over his features. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew the boy had it in him to do right. He was his grandfather's grandson, after all." He took a shaky breath, his gaze turning inward, looking back across the chasm of years. "I saw them," he said, his voice dropping low, thick with a guilt that was decades old. "The day old Arthur vanished. I was checking my trap lines, up on the ridge. I saw Caldwell's car down here. Not the fancy one he drives now, but an old black thing just as mean. I saw 2 of his men drag Arthur out of that cabin. He was fighting them, yelling, brave as a lion he was. Arthur's voice cracked, and he paused, his jaw working silently. They forced him into the woods, right over there. He pointed with his walking stick towards a particularly dark and dense patch of ancient pines. I heard him shouting. Then, nothing, just the wind. I was a young man then, but I was a coward. I hid. I did nothing. I ran home and locked my door and told myself it was none of my business, a cowardice I've had to live with every single day since. Then his focus shifted, snapping back to the present with a new urgency. Jazz, but your Mark, he wasn't a coward. Not in the end. He looked Ilara straight in the eye, his gaze intense. He came to see me, just over a week ago. Showed up at my cottage like a ghost in the night. He looked like he hadn't slept in a year. The guilt was eating him alive. He told me everything about the crew, about what they did to his grandfather, about the man Caldwell really is. He leaned closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. He told me he was going to burn it all down. He said he'd collected proof, confessions, ledgers, and he told me he'd hidden it all here, in the one place Caldwell would never think to look. He said he hid the truth inside the one pure thing he had left from his past. He told me to watch the cabin. He knew someone would come for it. Ilara finally understood the full, heartbreaking scope of Mark's plan. It wasn't just a confession meant to be found by chance. It was a message, a carefully laid trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to her, and then to Arthur. He had orchestrated this from beyond the grave, using their shared history as a map. The pure thing wasn't just a poetic phrase. It was a guide. It was the love she once had for him, a beacon he hoped would lead her to the truth and to the one man who could corroborate it. The weight of this intricate, desperate plan settled upon her. This was no longer just her fight. It was the continuation of his. She and Arthur, 2 people on opposite ends of a man's life, bound together by his death and his last, desperate act of courage. They were the 2 halves of a key that could unlock justice or get them both killed. Caldwell doesn't make second offers, Arthur said, his voice grim, pulling her from her thoughts. His weary eyes were now sharp with urgency. He's a snake. He's patient. But when he decides to strike, he doesn't miss. That visit wasn't a negotiation, it was an assessment. He was measuring you. And that warning he gave you, that wasn't just talk. In his eyes, you and these children. He glanced at Leo and Mia, who were now peering out from behind the porch steps. You're a loose end, and Caldwell snips loose ends. He will be back, and he won't be carrying a checkbook next time. A cold dread, more profound than any she had felt before, seeped into Ilara's bones. The crumpled business card in the dirt was a timer, counting down the last few hours of her life if she stayed here. The monster was no longer circling, it was coming straight for them. My place, Arthur said, jerking his head back towards the woods. It's not much, but it's safe. Built it up over the years. Caldwell has tried to get me out before. It's a fortress now. We can get there, but not in the open. Not in the day. He looked up at the sky where dark, bruised-looking clouds were gathering on the horizon, swallowing the blue. A storm's coming. A bad one. That's our chance. He'll make his move under the cover of the storm, thinking no one will see or hear. He'll want to make it look like an accident. A fire. A tragic event. That's his way. The old man's paranoia, born of decades of fear and regret, was now their greatest asset. He had been planning for this day his whole life. I have a phone. Satellite. Can reach anyone, anywhere. We get to my cottage, we make the call. But we have to survive the night first. Ilara looked from Arthur's determined face to her children's terrified one, and then at the rotting cabin that held all of Mark's secrets. Running had been her first instinct. But now, running felt like a betrayal of Mark, of his grandfather, and of Arthur, who had lived with his cowardice for so long, and it wouldn't even guarantee safety. Caldwell was a man who owned the world, it seemed. Where could she run that he couldn't find her? Here, with Arthur, with the proof, she had a weapon. It was a terrifying double-edged sword, but it was the only one she had. A steely resolve settled over her. "We're not running," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Not anymore. We'll go with you. We'll make the call. We are going to finish what my husband started." For the first time, Arthur smiled. It was a grim, tight-lipped smile, but it was a smile of solidarity. The alliance was forged. The afternoon bled away into a tense, grey twilight. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an electrical stillness that precedes a violent storm. The birds in the forest fell silent. Ilara, Arthur, and the children worked with a quiet, desperate urgency inside the cabin. They gathered the few edible supplies they had left, a pathetic collection of crackers and dried fruit, and filled their only water bottle from a small, clean stream Arthur knew of nearby. The most important item, the bundle of letters, Ilara wrapped carefully in a plastic bag and secured deep inside her jacket. It felt like she was carrying a live grenade. Every rustle of the paper was a reminder of the stakes. Leo and Mia were quiet, their fear a palpable thing in the gloomy cabin, but they seemed to draw a strange comfort from the old man's calm, steady presence, and their mother's newfound resolve. They were a small, strange army, preparing for a siege. As the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, spattering against the dusty floorboards, the world outside plunged into a premature darkness. The storm broke with a sudden, violent fury. A deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the ruined cabin, and the sky opened up. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, lashing against the walls and pouring through the gaping hole in the roof. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, a high, mournful shriek that seemed to tear at the world. The sounds of the storm were apocalyptic, a chaotic symphony of cracking thunder, roaring wind, and the relentless drumming of the downpour. It was the perfect cover for violence, a world where screams would be swallowed by the gale. Arthur stood by a cracked window pane, peering out into the maelstrom, his old eyes watchful and alert. "He'll be coming soon," he muttered, his voice almost lost in the noise. Through the rain-streaked, grimy window, Ilara saw them first, two pinpricks of light, cutting through the torrential downpour and the inky blackness. Headlights. Her heart seized in her chest. It was not a luxury sedan, but a battered, mud-splattered pickup truck that lurched and slid into the clearing, its engine a low, menacing growl beneath the storm's fury. It came to a halt, its high beams slicing through the cabin's interior, throwing everything into a stark, terrifying relief of light and shadow. The engine cut, and for a moment there was only the sound of the storm. Then, two doors slammed shut. Two dark figures, bulky and broad-shouldered, emerged from the truck. They were silhouetted against the headlights, faceless, featureless avatars of violence sent to carry out Caldwell's final solution. They moved with a grim, unhurried purpose, their bodies braced against the driving wind and rain. Ilara's breath caught in a painful, silent gasp. One of the men reached into the bed of the truck and pulled out two large, red metal cans. Even from across the clearing, she could see the familiar shape. She could smell it in her mind, a scent memory that triggered a primal, absolute terror. Gasoline. Her blood ran cold. Arthur had been right. This wasn't a threat. This wasn't a final warning. This was an erasure. They were going to burn the cabin to the ground with them inside. They were going to turn her and her children into another one of Caldwell's unfortunate accidents, their bodies consumed by the flames, their story vanishing into smoke and ash. The letters in her jacket felt like they were on fire, branding her skin with the truth that was about to get them all killed. There was no more time for planning. There was only survival. The men split up, their movements chillingly efficient. One trudged around to the back of the cabin, disappearing into the darkness. The other approached the front, his boots sinking into the mud. Ilara could hear a sloshing sound, and then the distinct, metallic glug-glug-glug of liquid being poured from a can. It was a sickeningly mundane sound for such a monstrous act. The man was dousing the front porch, the dry, rotting wood soaking up the accelerant like a sponge. Even over the roar of the wind and the scent of the rain, a new smell began to permeate the air. The sharp, acrid, chemical stench of gasoline. It was the smell of imminent death. It filled Ilara's nostrils, her throat, her lungs, choking her with a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. The world narrowed to that single, terrifying smell and the sound of the approaching end. Panic, hot and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. The heavy wooden chest lay in the corner. For a mad second she thought of trying to save it, this last physical piece of Mark's history, but it was too heavy, too cumbersome. It was a coffin. She ripped the letters from her jacket. She shoved her own youthful letters. The pure thing. back down the front of her shirt, the plastic bag cold against her skin. She thrust the other bundle, Mark's confession, into Leo's hands. He flinched, his eyes wide with horror. "Leo, listen to me," she commanded, her voice a fierce, desperate whisper. "You hold on to these. Do not let go, do not lose them, no matter what happens. Do you understand me? No matter what." He stared at her, then at the precious, brittle pages, and nodded, his small hands clutching the bundle as if it were the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving into chaos. Mia was weeping, but making no sound, her small body shaking uncontrollably as she buried her face in Ilara's jeans. Leo stood frozen, a small soldier of terror, clutching the letters, his eyes fixed on the monstrous shadow of the man moving just outside the front wall. Ilara could see the man's shape through a wide crack in the boards. He was done pouring the gasoline. Now he was fumbling in his pocket. He brought his hands up to his face, cupping them against the wind. A tiny, flickering spark of orange appeared in the cup of his hands, a lighter. The flame, so small and fragile, was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. It was a tiny star signaling the end of their universe. They had seconds, maybe less. The man lowered the flame towards the sodden porch. Time stopped. The roar of the storm, the pounding of her heart. It all faded into a silent, screaming crescendo of anticipation. "Now!" The word was torn from Ilara's throat, a raw, guttural command. She grabbed Mia's arm and shoved Leo towards the back of the cabin, towards the small, dilapidated door that led into the deepest part of the forest. It was a door they had barely looked at, a path they hadn't considered. Arthur was already there, pulling at the rotted wood. The door, swollen with rain, resisted. With a desperate grunt, he put his shoulder into it, and it burst open with a crack of splintering wood. They plunged out of the cabin and into the full fury of the storm. The change was instantaneous and violent. The wind tore at them, and the cold, driving rain felt like needles on their skin. The darkness was absolute, a disorienting, impenetrable blackness. Behind them, through the open door, they could see the man at the front of the cabin finally touch his lighter to the gasoline-soaked wood. There was a low, hungry whoosh, and the night exploded into a horrifying, brilliant orange. Flames erupted, climbing the walls of the cabin with an unnatural speed, a roaring, ravenous beast unleashed. The sudden light illuminated the entire clearing, casting their fleeing shapes into sharp, running shadows. The forest, which had been a black void, was now a terrifying labyrinth of whipping branches and deep, sucking mud. Ilara clutched Mia's hand, her other hand on Leo's back, pushing him forward. She ran blindly, her feet slipping and sliding, her lungs burning. She had no idea where she was going, only that it was away from the inferno that had once been their only hope. The roar of the fire was a physical force, a wave of heat and sound that pursued them, reaching for them with fiery claws through the trees. The world was a nightmare of fire, water and wind. Just as despair threatened to swallow her, a light bobbed in the darkness ahead. It was a small, swinging lantern, a tiny, defiant beacon in the overwhelming chaos. Arthur. He had gotten out just ahead of them, a promise kept. He raised the lantern high, its weak yellow light cutting a small circle in the maelstrom. "This way," his reedy voice shouted, barely audible over the combined roar of the fire and the storm. "Hurry, they've seen us!" He turned and scrambled away, his old body moving with a surprising agility born of fear and familiarity with the terrain. He was their only hope, their only guide through this hellscape. Ilara fixed her eyes on the bobbing light and forced her screaming legs to move faster, dragging her children through the grasping undergrowth, away from the fire and towards the faint, flickering promise of safety. The heat at their backs was intense, a constant reminder of the death they had so narrowly escaped. Behind them, angry shouts cut through the noise. The thugs. The fire had not been the trap they intended. It had become a giant spotlight, exposing their escape. "They're getting away!" one of them bellowed. The sounds of heavy bodies crashing through the undergrowth began behind them, clumsy and loud. They were being pursued. The flight became even more frantic. The hidden trail Arthur followed was barely a trail at all, a winding, treacherous path through thickets of thorns and over slippery, moss-covered roots. Branches whipped at their faces, tearing at their skin and clothes. Mia stumbled and fell, and Ilara hauled her back to her feet without breaking stride. Leo, his face a mask of grim determination, still clutched the letters, holding them against his chest as he ran. The sounds of their pursuers seemed to be getting closer, their angry curses carried on the howling wind. Just when Ilara thought her lungs would burst, that her legs would give out, a shape loomed out of the darkness ahead. It was a low, dark structure, hunkered down against the forest floor, its profile barely visible against the storm-tossed trees. It looked less like a cottage and more like a small, camouflaged bunker. Arthur's home. It was their sanctuary. Arthur scrambled up a short flight of stone steps and shoved at a massive wooden door. It swung inward, revealing a dark, welcoming void. "Inside! Get inside, now!" he yelled, waving them in frantically. Ilara pushed her children through the doorway, almost throwing them into the darkness, and tumbled in after them, collapsing onto a hard-packed dirt floor. The sounds of their pursuers were alarmingly close now. Just beyond the small clearing that surrounded the cottage, they were seconds away from being caught. Arthur slammed the heavy door shut behind them, the sound cutting off the roar of the storm. With a grunt of effort, he threw a thick iron bolt across the door. The sound of the bolt sliding home was a solid, definitive, beautiful clang. It was the sound of safety. They were inside. They were alive. Ilara lay on the floor, gasping for air, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. She pulled Mia and Leo close, their small, shivering bodies pressed against hers. The rich, comforting scent of dry wood smoke and old books filled the air. Through the thick walls, she could hear the muffled shouts of the thugs outside, followed by the continuing roar of the storm and the distant, fading crackle of the fire that was consuming her past. They were safe, for now, trapped in a tiny fortress, with the letters, their only weapon, clutched tightly in their hands. The turning point was past. The war had begun. The heavy iron bolt sliding home was the most beautiful sound Ilara had ever heard. A solid, definitive clang that shut out the world of fire and violence. The roar of the storm was now a muffled, distant beast. Inside the small cottage, the air was warm and smelled richly of dry cedar wood, old books, and the comforting aroma of a wood-burning stove that glowed in the corner. Adrenaline gave way to a violent, full-body tremor. She pulled her children close, their small, shivering bodies a testament to the horror they had just escaped. Arthur, moving with a grim purpose, ignored the chaos. He went to a heavy wooden trunk, unlocked it, and pulled out a clunky black device with a small antenna, a satellite phone. He extended the antenna, and the device chirped to life, its small screen casting a ghoulish green light on his wrinkled face. He punched in a number with a steady, practiced finger. Ilara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound of the beeps was alien and surreal in the rustic silence, a call to a world she wasn't sure still existed. Arthur's voice was low and urgent, a stark contrast to the storm's fury. "David, it's me. It happened." Ilara listened, her breath held tight in her chest. Arthur spoke in a clipped to efficient shorthand, the language of a man who had rehearsed this call in his mind for years. The Vance cabin. He sent men. They tried to burn them out. Mark Vance's wife and kids. Yes, she's here. She has it. David. She has the proof. Letters. Mark's full confession. Everything. The grandfather. His own murder. It's all here. There was a pause as the voice on the other end spoke. A tinny, distant squawk. "Yes, an execution," Arthur confirmed, his voice laced with venom. "They just torched the place. Attempted murder. We have them, David. We have Caldwell cold." The name David hung in the air, a phantom ally becoming real. This was no desperate call to a local sheriff. This was the activation of a long-dormant plan. Hope, terrifying and fragile, began to push through the layers of her fear. A real chance. They had a real chance. The hours that followed were a surreal limbo. The muffled shouts outside eventually faded as Caldwell's thugs, thwarted by the fortified cottage and the raging storm, retreated into the night. The storm itself slowly exhausted its fury, the thunder receding into low rumbles and the rain softening to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. Arthur made a small, pathetic meal of crackers and coffee, but no one could eat. They huddled together under a thick wool blanket near the stove, listening to the night. Ilara felt the phantom heat of the fire on her skin, and the acrid smell of gasoline was seared into her memory. She took out Mark's letters, the pages now damp and warped, and reread his final words by the dim light of Arthur's lantern. Don't let them get away with it. The words were no longer a plea, they were a commandment. She felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a diamond-hard resolve. She would not fail him. Not again. Dawn arrived not with light, but with the sound of engines. Not a single truck, but a convoy. Ilara's heart seized with fresh terror, but Arthur put a calming hand on her shoulder. "They're ours," he said. Peering through a small slit in the window shutters, she saw a line of dark, unmarked SUVs pulling into the muddy clearing. Men in dark uniforms, emblazoned with the letters of a federal task force, began to emerge, moving with a quiet, professional authority that was breathtaking. A man in a civilian trench coat broke away from the group and approached the cottage. This was David, the journalist. When Arthur opened the door, David's eyes found Ilara immediately. There was a profound respect and a deep sorrow in his gaze. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice gentle, "I am so sorry for your loss. Can I see them?" With a trembling hand, Ilara passed him the bundle of letters. The physical act of handing them over felt like shifting a mountain from her shoulders to his. The burden was no longer hers to carry alone. The narrative of justice unfolded with stunning speed. As dawn's grey light touched the windows of a sprawling mansion miles away, a different kind of storm broke. Federal agents, armed with a no-knock warrant, breached the gates of Mr. Caldwell's palatial estate. He was apprehended in his study, a room lined with leather-bound books and trophies celebrating his public philanthropy. The look on his face, as the cold, hard steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists, was not one of anger, but of utter, complete disbelief. It was the expression of a king who had never imagined his castle walls could be breached, a god who had forgotten he was mortal. The mask of the community benefactor, so carefully crafted over decades, shattered in an instant, revealing the hollow, terrified man beneath. The news cameras, brought by David, captured it all, the crumbling of an empire built on fear and blood, the final, pathetic moments of a tyrant's reign. The image was broadcast across the nation. The case against him was a fortress, impregnable and absolute. The letters from Mark provided an insider's roadmap to 2 decades of crime, naming names, dates, and locations. Arthur's eyewitness testimony, the long-suppressed account of a man finally unburdening his soul, corroborated the murder of Arthur Vance Sr. The gasoline cans and accelerant residue found at the charred remains of the cabin provided undeniable forensic proof of the attempted murder of Ilara and her children. The story exploded. As Caldwell's network of corruption was exposed, other victims and families terrorized into silence years ago began to come forward, their voices joining a chorus of accusation that could no longer be ignored. The high-profile investigation ripped through the state's corridors of power, exposing a rot that went deeper than anyone had imagined. It was a cleansing fire, started by the spark of a dead man's love letters. Justice for Ilara came not only in the form of Caldwell's life sentence, but in a way that fundamentally reshaped her world. The courts, untangling the web of fraudulent land acquisitions, ruled that the Blackwood Forest property, being the fulcrum of a criminal enterprise, reverted to the last legitimate heir, her. But it went further. As Caldwell's vast assets were seized by the government, a substantial portion was allocated to a restitution fund for his many victims. Ilara, as the catalyst for the entire investigation and a victim of attempted murder, received a settlement so large the number felt like a misprint on the page. She sat in a lawyer's clean, quiet office and stared at the check, her mind unable to process the string of zeros. She thought of the $300 she had counted on her dining room table, the pathetic pile of coins. The world had tilted on its axis. She was no longer just a survivor. She was wealthy, secure, free. The first thing she did was not cry or celebrate. It was an act of quiet, profound catharsis. She walked into the finest grocery store in the nearest city and filled a cart to overflowing. She bought thick, marbled steaks, crusty artisan bread, fresh vegetables, and a ridiculously expensive, multi-layered chocolate cake. That night, in a bright, clean rental house that smelled of fresh paint instead of mold. She watched Leo and Mia eat until their bellies were full. Their laughter, loud and carefree, echoed in the high-ceilinged kitchen. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. For the first time in months, she slept in a real bed with clean sheets, a deep, dreamless sleep free from the gnawing ache of hunger and the cold terror of the unknown. The relief was a physical sensation, a loosening of a knot that had been tied in her soul for so long. She had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without its constant pressure. She did not sell the land. It was her history, her children's legacy. It was a place of ghosts, but it was also a place of courage. With a fraction of her new wealth, she hired a team of architects. "I want a house filled with light," she told them, and they delivered. A beautiful, modern home of glass and warm cedar rose from the ashes of the old cabin, its huge windows looking out into a forest that now seemed peaceful, protective. She had her own room, a studio for her sewing. The hum of her new, professional-grade machine was a constant, happy sound, a counterpoint to the memory of silence and despair. She stitched together beautiful garments from fine fabrics, no longer patching worn-out clothes but creating new things. It was an act of reclamation, stitching together the torn fabric of her own life, creating a future as strong and beautiful as the threads she now held in her hands. Years later, on a warm summer evening, Ilara sat on the wide porch of her new home, watching the sun set through the trees. Arthur, now frail but with peace in his eyes, sat in a rocking chair, telling a story to a teenage Leo and a smiling Mia. The air was filled with the scent of grilled steak and the sound of their easy laughter. The forest was no longer a place of menace, but of beauty and tranquility, a sanctuary that had been paid for in blood, but reclaimed by love and courage. Ilara looked at her children, safe, happy, and thriving, and a profound sense of peace settled over her like a warm blanket. Mark's ghost was at rest. The cycle of violence was broken. She had not just survived, she had triumphed, forging a future of absolute safety and hope from the ashes of utter desperation. Ilara's story is a testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, a single spark of courage can ignite a fire that burns away the shadows. To hear more stories of incredible resilience and justice, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.